and within 6 months I was in Cyprus, which was then in terrorist.
History doesn't always remember people for what they wanted to be. Sometimes it remembers them for what they endured, or what they did in a single, irreversible moment. These aren't stories of fame chased or success planned. They're stories of ordinary people, and a few extraordinary ones, whose lives collided with tragedy so powerful that the world could not look away. Some stood alone in front of tanks. Some were lost just minutes before peace was declared. Some vanished without answers. Others became symbols long after their voices were silenced. In many cases, the tragedy was sudden. In others, it unfolded slowly, through injustice, sacrifice, or unimaginable cruelty. Today, we're looking at the most famous moments in history where tragedy transformed a person into a lasting symbol of humanity. Stories that still echo, because they remind us who we are, and who we can be. Let's begin. For 10. Tank Man, the unknown. Individual who stopped an army. On June 5, 1989, in Beijing, an unnamed man stepped into history and then disappeared from it. The day before, Chinese military forces had violently cleared protesters from Tiananmen Square, ending weeks of pro-democracy demonstrations with bloodshed. Hundreds, possibly thousands, were killed or injured. The world was already in shock. Then came the image. A single man, carrying shopping bags, stood directly in front of a column of advancing tanks. He was not wearing armor. He carried no weapon. There were no crowds behind him. Just silence, asphalt, and steel. The tanks stopped. When the lead tank tried to maneuver around him, the man stepped back into its path. At one point, he climbed onto the tank, appearing to speak to the crew inside, reportedly telling them to leave his city. The exchange was brief. Moments later, several men in blue rushed in and dragged him away, and that was it. The world never learned his name. Known only as Tank Man, his fate remains unknown. Some believe he was arrested and executed. Others think he was imprisoned. A few speculate that he survived, living anonymously, never revealing who he was. What makes Tank Man legendary isn't just his bravery, it's his anonymity. He wasn't a leader. He didn't give speeches. He didn't organize movements. He simply refused to move. The photograph, captured by multiple international journalists. Number 9. Henry Gunther, the last soldier to die in World War I. World War I officially ended at 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918. But for Henry Gunther, the war ended 1 minute too late. Gunther was born to a German-American family in Baltimore, Maryland. When the United States entered the war, he enlisted and was deployed to France. Like millions of others, he endured years of trench warfare, exhaustion, and loss. By November 1918, peace was finally at hand. The armistice had been signed at 5 a.m., with fighting scheduled to cease at exactly 11 a.m. Soldiers on both sides began preparing for silence. Some units had already stopped advancing. At 10:59 a.m., in a village near the German border, Gunther's unit encountered a small group of retreating German soldiers. According to accounts, the Germans attempted to signal that the war was ending. They shouted warnings. They fired into the air. Gunther kept charging. Why he advanced remains debated. Some historians believe he was trying to redeem a perceived loss of honor after being demoted. Others think confusion and adrenaline overtook reason. Whatever the cause, Gunther ran toward the enemy trench as the final seconds ticked down. The Germans, realizing he would not stop, fired. Henry Gunther was killed 60 seconds before the armistice took effect. He is widely considered the last American soldier to die in World War I and possibly the final combat fatality of the entire war. Henry Gunther didn't die to change history. He died because history couldn't stop fast enough. And that is why his name remains etched into memory, as a reminder of war's ultimate tragedy. Even peace comes too late for some. Martyr 8. Madeleine McCann, a child who became a global question. On the night of May 3, 2007, a quiet holiday apartment in Praia da Luz became the center of one of the most publicized missing person cases in modern history. Madeleine McCann, just 3 years old, vanished while sleeping in bed. Her parents, Kate and Jerry McCann, were dining at a nearby restaurant with friends, checking on their children periodically. When Kate returned to the apartment close to 10 p.m., Madeleine was gone. No signs of forced entry, no witnesses, no clear trail. What followed was chaos. Initially, local police treated the disappearance as a wandering child case, an assumption that would later draw heavy criticism. Hours turned into days, and days into weeks, as the realization set in that Madeleine had likely been taken. The story exploded beyond Portugal. International media descended. Sightings were reported across Europe, North Africa, and even as far as South America. Each claim sparked hope, and then heartbreak. None were confirmed. As the years passed, the case became increasingly complex. Suspects emerged and faded. Investigations shifted between Portuguese, British, and German authorities. At times, Madeleine's own parents were subjected to suspicion and relentless public scrutiny, their grief examined as if it were evidence. And yet, no definitive answers. What happened to Madeleine McCann? Her tragedy turned her into a global conscience, a reminder that behind headlines and theories is a child who never came home. And until there is closure, her story remains unfinished, suspended between hope and reality. 7. Elizabeth Short, the woman the world remembered for how she died. In January 1947, a passerby walking through a vacant lot in Los Angeles made a discovery that would shock America. The body of Elizabeth Short, a 22-year-old woman, had been brutally murdered. The crime scene was horrifying. Her body had been posed, mutilated, and left in a way that seemed designed to attract attention. Newspapers seized the story immediately. Within days, Elizabeth Short was no longer Elizabeth Short, she was the Black Dahlia. The nickname, inspired by a popular noir film and her dark hair, became inseparable from the case. Sensational headlines followed. Rumors spread that she was an aspiring actress, a drifter, a provocateur. Many of these claims were later proven false, but they stuck. The investigation was massive. Police questioned over 150 suspects. Confessions poured in, most fabricated. Leads went cold. Despite intense public pressure, no one was ever charged. And in that vacuum, myth replaced truth. Elizabeth's life was gradually erased by the spectacle of her death. She was remembered less as a person and more as a mystery. Over the decades, books, films, and documentaries speculated endlessly about who killed her, often reducing her to a symbol of Hollywood corruption or male violence. But those who knew her painted a different picture. The Black Dahlia became a cultural fixation. Elizabeth Short became a footnote. Yet her story endures because it exposes something deeply human. Our tendency to sensationalize pain, to turn victims into legends while forgetting their humanity. Elizabeth Short didn't choose fame. Tragedy gave it to her, and nearly 80 years later, she remains one of history's most haunting reminders that some lives are remembered not for how they were lived, but for how they were lost. Gunther 6. Joan of Arc. Faith, fire, and a nation's awakening. Born around 1412 to a peasant family in rural France, Joan of Arc was never meant to be remembered by history. She couldn't read or write, she had no military training, and yet by the age of 17, she would change the course of a nation's destiny. France was locked in the brutal 100 Years' War, losing ground to English forces and their allies. Morale was collapsing. Then came Joan's claim. She said she heard divine voices instructing her to save France and crown the rightful king, Charles VII. Most would have dismissed her as delusional. Instead, against all odds, she was believed. Joan was given armor, a banner, and command authority. In 1429, she led French forces to a decisive victory at the Siege of Orléans, a turning point that revived French confidence and shifted the war's momentum. Soldiers followed her not because of rank, but conviction. Her presence inspired belief where there had been despair. But history is rarely kind to its miracles. In 1430, Joan was captured by Burgundian forces allied with England. What followed was not a fair trial, but a calculated execution disguised as justice. She was charged with heresy, not for violence, but for wearing men's clothing, claiming divine guidance, and threatening the existing power structure. At just 19 years old, Joan was burned alive at the stake. Her execution was meant to erase her. Instead, it immortalized her. Years later, the very church that condemned her would reverse the verdict. In 1456, Joan was declared innocent. In 1920, she was canonized as a saint. Joan of Arc became more than a historical figure. She became a symbol of faith over fear, of courage against authority, of how society often destroys those who disrupt its comfort. Her tragedy didn't silence her message, it amplified it. She didn't just fight for France. She became France. 05. Emmett Till, a child whose death changed a nation. In August 1955, Emmett Till, a 14-year-old black boy from Chicago, traveled to Mississippi to visit relatives. What happened next would become one of the most defining tragedies in American history. Till was accused of offending a white woman, Carolyn Bryant, at a local store, an accusation that would later be recanted decades afterward. Days later, her husband Roy Bryant and his half-brother J.W. Millam abducted Emmett from his great-uncle's home in the middle of the night. They tortured him, they murdered him. They dumped his body in the Tallahatchie River. When Emmett's body was recovered, it was nearly unrecognizable. What turned this tragedy into a defining moment wasn't just the brutality, it was what followed. An all-white jury acquitted Bryant and Millam after barely an hour of deliberation. Protected by double jeopardy laws, the men later admitted to the murder in a paid interview. They never faced consequences. But Emmett's mother, Mamie Till Mobley, made a decision that would echo through history. She insisted on an open casket funeral so the world could see what racism had done to her son. The images were unbearable and unavoidable. Emmett Till became a catalyst. His death ignited outrage. It mobilized activists. It galvanized a movement. Leaders of the civil rights movement, including Rosa Parks, later said Emmett Till was on their minds when they took their stands. Emmett didn't choose to be a symbol. He was a child. But his tragedy forced America to confront a truth it had long avoided. His name became shorthand for injustice, racial terror, and the cost of silence. Today, Emmett Till is remembered not just for how he died, but for what his death demanded the world become. For 4. Henrietta Lacks, the woman who changed medicine without knowing it. In 1951, a 31-year-old black woman named Henrietta Lacks walked into Johns Hopkins Hospital seeking treatment for severe abdominal pain. She was a mother of 5, a tobacco farmer by trade, and like many patients of her era, she trusted doctors without question. The diagnosis was aggressive cervical cancer. During her treatment, doctors took a sample of her tumor, without her knowledge or consent, and sent it to a laboratory. What they discovered would quietly revolutionize science. Unlike previous samples, Henrietta's cancer cells didn't die. They multiplied, rapidly, endlessly. They became the first immortal human cell line. Known as hela cells, they were distributed to laboratories around the world. They helped develop the polio vaccine. They advanced cancer research, gene mapping, IVF, chemotherapy, and countless other breakthroughs. Entire industries were built using cells taken from Henrietta Lacks. She never knew. Henrietta died later that year, buried in an unmarked grave. Her family was not informed that parts of her body were still alive, being cloned, sold, studied, and profited from. For decades, her children lived in poverty while companies made millions from hela cells. The tragedy wasn't just her death, it was erasure. Henrietta's name was absent from textbooks. Her consent was never sought. Her humanity was overshadowed by scientific progress. It wasn't until the 1970s, long after her death, that her family even learned what had been done. When the truth emerged, it forced the world to confront uncomfortable questions. Who owns the body? Who benefits from medical progress? And whose lives are considered expendable in the pursuit of knowledge? 3. Maximilian Kolbe. Choosing death. So another could live in the darkness of Auschwitz in 1941. Survival was measured in hours, not hope. Prisoners were starved, beaten, and stripped of identity. Life held little value, except to those desperate to keep it. Among the prisoners was Maximilian Kolbe, a Polish Franciscan priest who had been arrested for sheltering persecuted Jews and refugees after Nazi forces invaded Poland. One day, after a prisoner escaped the camp, Nazi guards selected 10 men at random to be executed as punishment. One of the chosen men, Franciszek Gajowniczek, collapsed in despair, crying out that he would never see his wife and children again. Kolbe stepped forward. He volunteered to die in the man's place. The guards were stunned. Substitution was unheard of, but they accepted. Kolbe was sent to a starvation bunker with the other condemned men. Over the next 2 weeks, prisoners died one by one. Witnesses later said Kolbe led prayers, sang hymns, and comforted others until he was the last one alive. When he refused to die, guards ended his life with a lethal injection. He was 47 years old. The man he saved survived the war. Gajovnichik spent the rest of his life telling Kolbe's story, not as legend, but as proof that compassion could exist even in humanity's darkest place. Kolbe's sacrifice rippled outward, becoming a symbol of moral courage that transcended religion. In 1982, Maximilian Kolbe was canonized as a saint. But sainthood isn't why he endures. He endures because his act defied the logic of cruelty. In a system designed to erase empathy, he chose love. In a place where life was disposable, he declared it sacred. Kolbe didn't resist with weapons. He resisted with selflessness. His tragedy didn't make him famous. His choice made him eternal. Number 2, Rescorla, the man who refused to accept fate. On September 11, 2001, as panic spread across New York City, one man remained eerily calm inside the World Trade Center. His name was Rescorla, and his story would become one of the quiet heroics of that day. Born in England and raised in Rhodesia, Rescorla was a seasoned soldier who had survived some of the bloodiest battles of the Vietnam War. He understood chaos, he understood fear, and most importantly, he understood preparation. Years before 9/11, Rescorla became head of security for Morgan Stanley, whose offices occupied multiple floors of the South Tower. Unlike others, he believed an extremist attack on the towers was not a question of if, but when. He pushed relentlessly for evacuation drills, stairwell training, and emergency protocols, often clashing with executives who felt he was overreacting. On the morning of 9/11, after the North Tower was struck, many companies were told to stay put. Rescorla ignored the order. He immediately began evacuating nearly 2,700 Morgan Stanley employees, directing them calmly to stairwells instead of elevators. To keep panic at bay, he sang Irish folk songs, military anthems, anything to keep people moving and breathing. Witnesses later said his voice carried through the stairwells like an anchor. Once most employees were safely out, Rescorla did what he had always done as a leader. He went back in. Floor by floor, he searched for anyone left behind. When the South Tower collapsed, Rescorla was still inside. Because of his defiance and preparation, Morgan Stanley lost far fewer employees than nearly any other firm in the towers. Thousands lived because one man trusted his instincts over bureaucracy. Rescorla didn't seek recognition. He didn't wait for permission. He simply acted. His tragedy turned him into a legend not because he died, but because of how many others lived. In moments of unimaginable terror, he embodied leadership, courage, and humanity. Rescorla proved that heroes aren't born in chaos. They're forged long before it arrives. Thugger 1. Anne Frank, a voice the world couldn't silence. In 1942, a 13-year-old Jewish girl went into hiding with her family in Nazi-occupied Amsterdam. Her name was Anne Frank, and she had no idea her private thoughts would one day speak for millions. As Adolf Hitler's persecution of Jews intensified, the Frank family hid in a secret annex above an office building, joined by others fleeing arrest. For over 2 years, Anne lived in silence, fear, and confinement, yet her inner world expanded. She wrote. In her diary, Anne documented everything: frustration, hope, humor, anger, and dreams of becoming a writer. She wrote not like a victim, but like a teenager trying to understand the world, and herself, while trapped inside it. In 1944, the annex was betrayed. Anne, her sister Margot, and the others were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Just weeks before liberation, Anne and Margot died of typhus at Bergen-Belsen in 1945. Anne was only 15. Her father, Otto Frank, was the only one to survive. When he returned to Amsterdam, he found Anne's diary. He read it and realized the world needed to hear his daughter's voice. Published in 1947, The Diary of a Young Girl became one of the most important books in history. Anne Frank didn't die a hero. She died a child, but her words became immortal. Her diary transformed the Holocaust from statistics into humanity. 6 million deaths became one voice, honest, hopeful, painfully real. Anne didn't write as a symbol. She wrote as a person, and that is why she endures. Anne Frank became famous not because of how she died, but because of how deeply she lived, even in the face of horror. Her tragedy turned her into a universal reminder of innocence lost, hatred unchecked, and the power of testimony. She proved that even in darkness, a human voice can outlive cruelty. These stories remind us that fame doesn't always come from achievement. Sometimes it comes from endurance, sacrifice, and unimaginable loss. Which of these stories stayed with you the longest? And is there someone else whose tragedy turned them into a symbol of humanity that we should have included? Share your thoughts in the comments. If these stories moved you, consider liking the video. It helps keep these legacies alive. And subscribe for more deep dives into the moments where history, tragedy, and humanity collide. Some stories never fade because they remind us who we are.